I think this new conception of industrial policy as something that needs to be targeted mostly on services is something that developing countries haven't yet gotten their minds around, but I think will have to.
Welcome to VoxDevTalks. My name is Tim Phillips. Many economists have historically argued that the best industrial policy is none at all. It appears that policymakers didn't agree because recent research shows that many of them have endorsed and continue to use industrial policy. But what does this phrase mean today, and how can it be best employed to kickstart economic development? Dani Rodrik of Harvard is one of the authors of a new paper about the changing economics of industrial policy. When I spoke to him, we began by discussing what traditionally we have understood by that phrase, industrial policy.
I think probably one standard formulation that critics would use was the notion of picking winners, that government would intervene and try to identify winners up front and then support them with a variety of subsidies and fiscal incentives.
What sort of countries were using policies like this? What were they using it for?
Industrial policy really never went away. So countries all over the world were using industrial policy. In fact, probably Hong Kong is the only country that has not used industrial policy. Even there, they have certainly had sectoral policies like support for housing, which, given my definition of industrial policy, which is definite support for certain sectors of the activity, might qualify as industrial. Well, but I think people thought of industrial policy as the import substitution policies of Latin America and South Asia and Africa, so supporting import competing firms with trade barriers. They would think about in East Asia, the support for export-oriented manufacturing firms in South Korea and Taiwan, and subsidies on foreign investors that country like Malaysia used. And in Europe, it would be support for national champions, whether it was the national auto firms or in France, Minitel or the Airbus. In the United States, people were merrily going around like, the U.S. has no industrial policy, which of course was not true. Even Reagan was engaged in industrial policy by protecting the auto sector, the steel sector, motorcycles. So it was really everywhere.
Can we clarify what the economic argument is against this that meant that the economics profession was pretty united in criticizing it?
So that is true. The economics profession until recently tended to be at best lukewarm about the industrial policy. And it's interesting that it's really not because the conceptual or theoretical arguments for industrial policy were invalid. I think certainly most economists working on developing countries would believe that the fundamental market failures which create the rationale for industrial policy, such as learning externalities and spillovers and coordination failures, were really quite rampant. Nor was it that there was, we had really good causal evidence that industrial policy didn't work, because I think the evidence that we had a decade or so ago was really mainly correlational. So it really wouldn't pass the kind of causal inference tests that economists would like to apply. It was much more based on sort of pragmatic considerations that governments couldn't pick winners, so they couldn't intervene effectively, and they were engaged in trying to intervene in favor of certain firms or sectors of activities that, even if they had the best intentions in mind, and that the process would be overwhelmed by political considerations and rent-seeking and lobbying and be abused by well-connected firms. The argument when you pushed economists as to why they were against industrial policy would be really very pragmatic, not deeply thought out answers rather than those based on their professional competence.
As you say, Dani, this story of industrial policy stretches unbroken across decades now, because I'm speaking to you. Is the mix of policies that we would call industrial policy very different?
The one thing that has really changed, I think, first, is that industrial policy is now being done in a much more self-conscious way in places like the United States and many countries in Europe compared to the heyday of skepticism on industrial policy, like the 1990s and 2000s. So I think the big change is that the Biden administration not only engages in industrial policy, but basically screams it from the rooftop, saying that we are doing industrial policy and that's a good thing. And I think that's good because if you're doing it self-consciously, you lay out a strategy, you think about carefully, you have a chance to think about the pros and cons. In terms of how the practice has changed, industrial policy is being carried out in pursuit of a wider range of objectives than we traditionally thought of it. So traditionally, industrial policy was really about innovation, productivity in the most advanced sectors of the economy, and to promote industrialization and advanced manufacturing. That clearly remains part of the objective in a lot of the U.S. industrial policies, but we now also have things like promoting resilience in supply chains. We have promoting the climate transition and investing in green industries. We have the new objective of promoting good jobs. And finally, but certainly not least important, we have the objective of enhancing U.S. and Western standing in the geopolitical competition with China. So it has a very much a national security goal as well.
I want to ask you a little bit more about the evidence for and against industrial policy here. You mentioned that there was quite poor evidence about whether industrial policy worked well, but for policies that absorb so much political capital and financial capital as well, why do we not know more about what works in a causal sense?
Causal inference is generally hard, and it's even harder for industrial policy because it's very difficult to run an experiment on industrial policy and then, apply the usual experimental methods. And it's taken a while for people to figure out how to get at this question. As I mentioned earlier, most of the so-called evidence on industrial policy's inefficacy was based on correlational work, essentially correlating some measure of performance at the level of industries with some measure of government intervention. And that really was plagued with a lot of problems. If governments were explicitly focusing on sectors or firms that would have performed even worse otherwise, you cannot really simply read off from that straightforward correlation, even if we're negative, that intervention was a bad idea. What happened, I think, alongside the general credibility revolution in economics, that once people started to think harder about causal inference, we started to get two kinds of evidence that really didn't exist. One was using historical or geographical accidents as instances of natural experiments to see when, for some completely historical or accidental reason, government, for example, shuts off part of its economy from trade. You have then the industries that get this kind of protection. How do they do in the longer run? So, examples of blockades that occur during a war, for example. And then looking at using methods of either instrumental variables or differences in differences in a way to get at issues of causal evidence. And we've had a variety of regional industrial policies evaluated using such methods in more recent words, carefully comparing regions that where investments were subsidized or promoted from other regions that weren't, but are otherwise similar. And then we can see whether the effects on employment and capital and so forth and structure of economic activity mattered. And this sort of more recent evidence that's much more careful doesn't necessarily resolve the debate, because I don't think you can actually resolve it on the basis of these individual studies, but do suggest two kinds of results that lead us to a more positive evaluation of industrial policy. One is that when certain sectors receive protection or more government promotion, that can lead to longer-term structural change. And secondly, that governments, when they do choose to intervene in certain types of sectors, that they can, at least from a narrow standpoint of effectiveness, that is, do the industries that were targeted by government policy eventually did expand and increase in terms of capacity and employment? And the answer seems to be generally yes. So those are the kinds of results that the new evidence is able to produce.
So if we're thinking about industrial policy as an engine of economic development in low-income countries or of structural transformation, are there country case studies that we can look to where this has been successful?
The gold standard of industrial policy practice is still the East Asian growth miracles, South Korea and Taiwan in the 60s and 70s, China, which has done extraordinarily well with industrial policies, most recently in renewables like solar cells or wind. And these are examples where industrial policies have been successful in terms of creating new industries and creating new competences and new areas of comparative advantage. There have been other areas, other countries, whether it's the special economic zone in Mauritius that created a kind of the export sector in garments, or it is even in a very unlikely setting of Argentina where we think about industrial policies having gone completely wrong, where very similar policies have been applied to agricultural productivity innovation and promoting new technologies and productive diversification in agriculture. Public institutions working together with the agricultural producers have been very successful at generating and disseminating agricultural innovation. So even in settings where we normally think that industrial policies haven't worked well, in Latin America, we can find instances where they've been successful.
In those particular contexts, what lessons can we draw about what works?
The specific instruments tend to be highly context specific. So I think one thing that we're learning is we need to get away from industrial policy and thinking of it as simply as subsidies or tax incentives. It's much broader than that. And many of the successful cases really are engaged in producing government support in different ways, whether it is understanding what the obstacles are and removing regulatory obstacles, or creating national standards or disseminating information or providing access to particular types of infrastructure, whether it's logistics or transport, or providing access to particular types of technology. So it's really a much broader variety of public support, and even government attention is part of industrial policy when you're talking to producers, because that's something that's limited supplies. If you're talking to sector A, you're spending less time talking to sector B. Good industrial policies entail a lot of collaboration and iteration with the private sector. That is, talking to them, having the mechanisms for consultation, deliberation, information revelation about where the problems are, rather than starting from an ex-ante notion that, it's a credit market failure, so I have to give long-term credit. Or it's a problem with exporting, I should subsidize their exports. And then revising your supports as you learn more about them. Second, I think, is this broader range of supports and ability to respond. Depending on what the problem is, you'll need to deploy different types of instruments. So a capacity to coordinate and deploy the needed responses, I think, is a key thing. And third, of course, a capacity to revise your policies, because not all supported sectors will be winners. So what's critical in running a good industrial policy is not an ability to pick winners, but it's the ability to let the losers go. So you need to figure out which are the losers and how to let them go. So, ability to dynamically reshape your policies and supports as you find out more is also another common component.
But it sounds from what you're saying as if creating a model or a template for industrial policy and how it should be used, even in superficially similar economies, is not going to be an effective way of going about this.
Not a template in the form of, here is the instrument you should use and here are the sectors you should promote. I don't think that's the right one. But there is a kind of a template, which is a series of questions you want to ask yourself if you're a government engaged in. So one is, what are your institutions for interacting and figuring out what the needs of different segments of the private sector are? Do you have those institutions of deliberation and problem identification in place? And those could be a variety of formal or informal institutions. And you don't want these to be simply, your annual National Congress of Business meetings. So, you want this to be at different levels with different groups of business people and entrepreneurs. Second, do you have a capacity to coordinate and to respond to these? And third, what are your mechanisms for monitoring and evaluation, whether you're doing? So each one of these principles calls for a certain set of capacities and capabilities that you have to put in place. if you're doing industrial policy, these are the kinds of questions you want to ask. Now, the answers in terms of what are the specific institutions and the specific tools that are being deployed will differ from country to country. But I think you will need all these elements in place.
Okay, so when we're thinking about policy in low-income countries, I guess one of the first things that we have to accept is that this is not about manufacturing anymore. It's, if we're looking at something that's going to create structural transformation, there is a far higher element of services, companies. Is that correct? And does that change how we think about policy?
Yeah, I think that's really one of the most important things. While I believe that developing countries need to engage with industrial policy, it's really not the industrial policy of the old.
Yeah.
You don't want to think about today's industrial policies for developing countries in the same way that we thought about industrial policy for South Korea and Taiwan. So it's not going to be mainly based on export subsidies or credit subsidies. It's not going to be mainly based on promoting manufacturing. It's not going to be mainly based on promoting exports. So what is it going to be based? First, it's going to be a wider range of public inputs and public supports of the type I mentioned before. It's going to be based largely on services, because this is the critical labor absorbing sector today in the developing countries, whether it's low income or middle income. Manufacturing is not absorbing workers. And so focusing on manufacturing may produce limited gains in terms of productivity, but if you're supporting enclave sectors that are going to be relatively narrow segments that won't be absorbing your most important resource, which is labor. So you want to focus on the sectors that are going to be mostly in services, whether it's in retail or personal services or education or health. That's really where we need to focus on identifying productivity bottlenecks and solving them. And so I think this new conception of industrial policy as something that needs to be targeted mostly on services is something that developing countries haven't yet gotten their minds around, but I think will have to.
For the policymakers in those countries, one thing we often hear is that they have very limited knowledge about the firms that make up their economy or the people that work in or manage those firms as well. What can we do about that to avoid them making expensive policy mistakes?
So that's critical, and it becomes even more critical when you're talking about doing industrial policy for services, because services are such a hodgepodge of different kinds of activities, from self-employed, informal firms to micro enterprises and so forth. And so there's no way you can really just pick who to support. So you need to think differently. And one mechanism that generally helps here is to set up processes which allow the more entrepreneurial firms and managers or the more dynamic micro enterprises to select themselves into programs. So you need to have incentives for self-selection. So for example, one mechanism that tends to work, has been evaluated, tends to produce good results, are things like business competitions for business plans, or setting up various support programs to which firms can opt in return for a certain degree of monitoring by the government and certain engagement in soft conditionalities, so that basically you're trying to separate out the more entrepreneurial among these self-employed business people or the micro enterprises and those that are really basically are not going to go anywhere. And I think that's one of the mechanisms for self-selection that can be used.
Sometimes public policy is slow to absorb the latest evidence that we have. In your experience, are there policies, potential industrial policies, that could be used in these development settings that are still underemployed?
Beneath the radar, there are a lot of experiments that's happening, and typically at the subnational level, that one can learn from and try to expand on. When we talk about industrial policy, our focus goes to the national capitals and the supports for large firms. But the type of industrial policy I'm talking about that's going to matter is things that happens typically at the level of individuals, if it's a federal government in the states, or at the municipal level, with local policymakers engaging with domestic service providers and firms and trying to figure out how to help them. There's a variety of examples. Experiments in India helping cab aggregators expand employment and find drivers. Experiments in Colombia or Nigeria for various types of business plan competition, providing support for retailers to enhance their efficiency of their supply chains through various centralized platforms. There's a lot of experiments that either have been evaluated or not evaluated but are promising that are taking place but remain relatively under the radar when we discuss industrial policy. That always seems like it's this very big strategic thing that's directed from the national capital.
It's a very exciting, very creative topic, and I'm sure it's something we're going to be talking a lot more about in the next few years. But for now, Dani, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
If you want to read more about this, there is a paper called The New Economics of Industrial Policy, and the authors are Rekha Juhas, Nathan Lane, and Dani Rodrik. It is forthcoming in the Annual Review of Economics, but you can also find it online. This has been a VoxDevTalk. The best way to make sure you don't miss an episode is to subscribe. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts, and our past episodes, as always, are at voxdev.org, where you will find articles about the papers we feature.